Hello and welcome to another session of Quick Glance on the Azure Developer CLI. Well, this time we will look at running and debugging apps that are enabled for the Azure Developer CLI. So how can I integrate my development flow, developing apps locally, wanting to debug the code locally, using the Azure Developer CLI and the tooling that comes with that. Now, there is within the Microsoft documentation a complete section about running and debugging apps enabled for Azure Developer CLI. Now, due to the fact that the setup that we already saw in the previous video that I will reference in the show notes, is that the overall the apps are, I wouldn't call it complex, but they have a lot of moving bits and pieces in there, like a Cosmos DB, a Key Vault, and so on and so forth. Now, for that, in order to be able to debug the apps, you basically don't want to set all of those things up locally, but probably you would do a hybrid approach, and that is what the Azure Developer CLI also does. So in order to running your code locally and being able to debug your apps, you need to provision things on Azure. Now, within this section, within the Microsoft documentation, we have the usual prerequisites that we need in order to get the Azure Developer CLI up and running. Of course, we need the Azure Developer CLI per se. We will use again the Node.js app that I have deployed in the previous videos. So we will use the to-do Node.js Mongo Azure Container app in order to get things running. And well, what we already did, we initialized our setup. So we have everything cloned locally. And what we also have is we have provisioned the Azure resources. Now, within the video of the going into the code that gets deployed locally, or gets cloned locally and then deployed within the containers, we already took a look at the .vs code directory, where we have the usual suspects in there, like a launch.json and a task.json, that come predefined with the template. So we already have the necessary configuration in order to start and debug the API, as well as the web front end. Now, I will focus on the API, so the back end for this video, so that is what we will do. As I said, we already provisioned the resources to Azure, so let's shortly check that. We have our resource group. We have all the resources in there, including the Cosmos DB, the dashboard, Key Vault, and so on. And we already have created 2 lists with some items in them. And now let's see how we can access them locally. Now, in order to debug the API, we have to start the debugger, which will then hopefully do everything that is necessary in order to make the API accessible locally, and then making it able to debug it. So let's switch to VS Code and check that. So what we have is we have our source folder. We want to debug the API. And within the source folder, it's an Express app. We go into the routes area, into the lists. And what we want to check is we want to debug I get a list of to-do lists. Okay, that's what we want to have. So let's put some breakpoints in here to see that we jump in and can really debug things. And now what we have to do, well, as usual, we will run. And here, as you can see, we already have 2 configurations that we have here in our VS Code folder. As mentioned in the help, we have the launch.json to launch the application and the tasks.json to we have the launch.json for the debugging, I would guess. Yeah, we have the debug API and the debug web. Here we go. And we have the tasks.json to start or to start the web app, so to start the web front end and to start the API. So that's all there, and that's what we will leverage now when starting debugging the API. So we will kick that off, which should then hopefully start our debugger. As we can see here, that was a bit hidden. Okay, that's the typical current npm1 commands with respect to the configuration. Nothing to see here, move on. And as you can see here, it now makes the connection and does all the necessary steps in order to be able to access the API on port 3100 on the local host. Now what I did is I am using the REST extension and created a request.http file which allows me to do the same things that you would do with curl or with Postman. So what we can do is we can, of course, call our remote API. So I will make that a bit smaller, remove that. So just to see that everything, that we have a remote app running, which returns a 200 with two lists. As you can see, we did not jump in any breakpoint because we called the remote API. So that's working. And now we want to test our local API being connected to the remote services. So I will now use the localhost 3100 and go to the same endpoint and send the request. And now we are jumping directly into the debugger. And yeah, we can see we have here the query, which is populated. Skip and top, we did not provide anything, so this should be 0 and this should be the default, which is 20. And then we fetch the lists, and then we return the response as a JSON object. So when we do that, what we will see is we see exactly the same values, of course, because we are using the same Cosmos DB as the deployed app. But we have been requesting it via our local API. So that's quite cool, and that's really quite handy to have this as part of your development flow out of the box. So I will now stop the debugger again, which will then detach the debugger, of course. Let me shortly remove that before I forget it. And yeah, that I think is really super cool to have that within your flow. So you develop locally, you provision all the stuff on Azure, and then you can make your changes locally, link things together in a hybrid way, and check your changes of your code against the data on Azure. Of course, it makes sense to pair that with the right environment, so I wouldn't do that with the productive environment, right? Okay, so let's see if there is something more in there. So we have now debugged the API, which is quite easy. It's starting up the Express server. Now you can, of course, also debug the React front end, which means you start the corresponding tasks and then debug the web front end. So this is, from my perspective, a bit more of a hassle usually to get things connected in one run. But that also is provided by the setup that we saw with the tasks and all the other configurations in the .vs Code area that allows you to easily debug also this setup. And that's, I think, really quite useful that that's provided by the Azure Developer CLI in order to really make your life easier as a developer and supporting you in your development flow, in your development loop, by deploying things, then making some changes locally, checking if everything is working, debugging things if there is an error, and fixing things, and then deploying again with, and that's important, the support of the different environments that you define. So you can also debug then, depending on the authorization and authentication flows and your governance thingies around productive data. You can also, of course, then debug productively deployed apps, and that's also great. So with that, I think that's a really cool feature of the Azure Developer CLI, combining those things, allowing you to do those things, and giving you some head start with the predefined VS Code configurations. Now, that was it for today for the running and debugging of apps with the Azure Developer CLI. Stay tuned, there will be some more videos around the Azure Developer CLI. And with that, ABC, always be curious. See you next time. Bye.